All right, everybody, welcome to this little podcast thing. And I have a very special guest today, um, who is Danny Lennon from SigmaNutrition.com, who has a very cool podcast, which is definitely one of my favorites on the internet. And he has a lot of cool guests weekly that he interviews, and there are several that I've listened to over and over and over again. And Danny is a science geek and he has a master's in nutritional science. Is that right, Danny?
Yeah, you got it right, Abel. And thanks very much for the kind words as well. It means a lot to hear that.
Yeah, no worries, man. So, why don't you give a short introduction on yourself? When did you start Sigma Nutrition? What did you do before? And yeah, just who are you in general?
Yeah, cool. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible so not to bore people. But I suppose the cliff notes is when I went to university originally was to study biology and physics along with a diploma in education. So around that time, I was first getting access to scientific journals and learning how to interpret papers correctly in the field of biological sciences. But my big kind of hobby outside of academia was always sports. So I played a lot of soccer. When I got to university, I was doing a bit of MMA and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and just had a general interest in the gym as well. So I was really trying to work out how to improve my performance. And then because of that and learning how to dive into scientific papers, it ended up going into the scientific literature to work out some stuff around performance and eventually down the route of nutrition, where I really took a major interest. And so that was probably the start of it for me. Basically just kept reading science on nutritional science and learning more and more and more. And following that degree, ended up becoming a science teacher. Did that for about a year, but realized that nutrition was really where I was basically doing everything outside of work. My hobby was just reading about nutrition and trying to implement that. So decided to go back to university, get a master's degree in nutritional science, and then trying to just learn from the best people I could find. So attending seminars, doing mentorships, doing courses, and then trying to integrate that information together and with what was in the evidence base, and start putting my own opinions together. And that's how kind of Sigma Nutrition was born. And then you mentioned the podcast, which has been probably about 18 months. The podcast has been going now, thankfully doing really well. And yeah, so that's where we are now.
Sweet. And do some jiu-jitsu nowadays, right? I heard you mention that in a podcast of yours.
Yeah, I haven't trained in quite a while. I was doing it for a number of years. Got my blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Then a couple of years back, tore a labrum in my shoulder, kept me out for a while. Long story short, kind of started to rehab it, started to do a bit more weights and kind of more things on the strength side, and haven't got back into full-on training, I'd say in probably the last year or maybe 18 months, close to that. But it's something I will definitely get back to. It's one of those addictive types of sports. So something I will definitely be doing. But at the moment, it's pretty much just lifting is all the training I'm getting done.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually messed up my shoulder recently as well, and just been out of the gym, and it's so crippling. You should get on Kelly Starrett or someone into rehab and interview him about the shoulder impingement or something.
Yeah, I need to steal what he has. Yeah, no, Kelly Starrett's stuff seems to be really good. I know Eric Cressy does a lot of stuff with the shoulder as well, which when I was trying to read stuff around it, he was kind of one of the go-to guys. So it's something I think finally is kind of not as bad as it was. I managed to avoid surgery on it, so it's not so bad.
Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah, so as I mentioned, or as we talked about, you have a podcast which is doing really well. I have a few personal favorites, but I would be just wondering, what is your favorite or a couple of favorite interviews so far that you've done?
Yeah, there's it's hard to pick out, I suppose, a couple of favorites because some of them are I really enjoy for different reasons. But ones that kind of stick out to me, I think the Lyle McDonald episode 65, that got a massive reaction and people really, really enjoyed that. Not only because of the information, but I think the fact that Lyle was just really good at communicating that sort of stuff, and he's perhaps not been doing a ton of podcasts over the last number of years, despite the fact he's been around for like forever. Like 10, 15 years ago, he was writing about the topics that people are still kind of discussing now. And so to get some of his caliber and to do that show just turned out really well. So I was delighted with that. Eric Helms is another guy that I really, really respect. I kind of go back and forth with stuff with Eric a lot now, because he's just honestly one of not only a great researcher and a coach, but just an honest and genuine person. And so I've had him on twice, really enjoyed both of those. Mike Israel's episode, I think that was 43, seemed to get a really big reaction. I like a lot of what Mike's putting out. One recently, actually, Dr. Brendan Egan from here in Dublin was a big one for me, because I think there's a lot of research talent here that probably isn't showcased as much. And so it's was nice for me to get a Dublin-based researcher on, and I think he did a great job in the stuff he's putting out. Having been looking around at the stuff they're doing in that lab, it's some really interesting work. But there's probably tons of episodes that I'm missing now that are probably a big one. Martin MacDonald, I think that was episode 57, was for me one of my favorites because of the topics that were in there. I think they were a lot of the stuff that I've tended to talk about. And if you look at some of the blog posts I've done, there's been very kind of similar topics discussed as what we got into that episode. And I think I've mentioned a number of times on the podcast how big a role Martin has played in my career and the kind of direction I've gone. And I did a mentorship under him and learned a lot from his kind of critical thinking and evidence-based perspective, and it changed a lot for me. So I'm always very thankful of that. So that was a kind of important show for me. But they're the kind of few off the top of my head that seem to be the biggest ones that's coming to me. But like I say, there's I get something from nearly all of them. And I think that's the kind of key thing. What are the one or two things we can take from each episode and try and integrate that into our own current thinking?
Yeah. The one with Eric Helms is definitely one that's sticking out for me. Or I have several favorites as well, but I just remember listening to that first interview we've done with him about contest prep dieting and reverse dieting, and I was actually listening to that while I was in the middle of kind of just dieting down to like single digit body fat levels, and just listening to that was just like, wow, like just kind of like the moment when, you know, the light hits, like, oh my God, it really made me realize what are the sticking point that people hit when they're trying to achieve some goals that they wouldn't even think about. Like so much stuff is just coming down to psychological aspects and whatnot. And yeah, that was just a brilliant interview. So one thing that I want to bring up is that, you know, the reason I really like your podcast is because your attitude seems to be kind of different from the typical guru kind of health authorities out there. You know, it seems to be like your approach is more like, okay, let's talk to all these very knowledgeable people and take all the information that we can get, and then let's interpret it as well as we can. But it really seems to steer away from that guru sort of, you know, mentality, and that's just, you know, so refreshing these days, because we just have so much of them. And I think they, in a way, just pose such an obstacle for people with all their contrary and, you know, kind of opinion forming, you know. So I don't know, what do you think about that? And would you agree that that's a problem these days? And like, how do you view that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. And I think that's kind of been the biggest thing for me with the podcast, has been basing it around trying to be as objective as possible. And I do realize that everyone is going to have some bias in different directions, but trying to be objective and really draw conclusions from not only what the evidence says, but what I think is fair to say, and how far to bring different conclusions, I think, is the big thing. So I think the problem with people who are bought into a specific idea and then will only discuss that idea with other people who agree with that is that you're immediately narrow minding yourself into this that you're kind of reconfirming your own bias. And then the same thing with your listeners are hearing the same messages over and over again. And it may be something that's not actually based in evidence, or you haven't looked at the contrary opinions. So I think the big shift in the show from the start to where it is now has been really nailing in on how can we make this the best platform to give objective information, but without me trying to push people in one direction or another on what they should conclude from it. So I think my job then as the interviewer becomes to get people who have interesting perspectives onto the show, who are going to use some degree of science or evidence to back those opinions, trying to tease out the best information from them, and then let the listener kind of pick out the bits of wisdom that they think are good, or to at least get them interested in going and looking at that further, as opposed to me trying to tell them this is the way it is, and that's all there is to it. So I think the problem with a lot of, like you mentioned, some of like the gurus, this tends to be more in the like pseudoscientific realm, I see, where there's stuff that may not be all that evidence-based, that they're kind of pushing as an alternative or the new solution, and they found the way to finally fix something that conventional medicine doesn't, and all this sort of stuff. And it tends to kind of play back and forth like that. And it can be a bit of an issue because, like I say, not only are people getting wrong information, but they're not also getting access to contrary opinions. So I think you would have kind of been familiar with recently, we even had a couple of guests on who people even emailed me after knowing that my kind of opinion differed to that. But I think allowing them to get their information out, even though it was probably maybe contrary to a lot of the stuff that I talk about, I think is important, and having that bit of debate and at least highlights where we need to have these discussions and why they're so important. So I think you're completely right. The objectivity of the show is probably the number one thing I try and keep there. So maybe not everything is always going to be right. Like we might find research in the future that gives something new that we haven't discussed about. But I think my big thing is anything we say right now has to be what we can fairly conclude, and don't stretch that beyond what we currently have evidence to say.
Yeah, and it's funny. It's just there was one line in your interview with Richard Nicolai, right? And it just keeps ringing in my ear because it was just so, I think it sums it up so perfectly, the whole situation, when he said that let's look at all the information that comes out from all these different groups like vegan, high carb, low carb, paleo, and let's try to hit the fattest part of that bell curve. And let's try to just look at what makes most sense. And instead, people just want to go to the extremes and just completely isolate themselves into one little corner. And your reaction to that was, yeah, totally. And if you look at it logically, if you're eating a wide variety of foods and not really being extreme in any one direction, then the chance of being very deficient in some kind of nutrient or any kind of dietary deficiency is very little. So why not just eat a whole variety of foods? But that just makes too much sense for people. Right. And it's just so funny because yeah, like it's kind of old housewife logic, but probably still the right one,
Yeah, I think one big example would be if you take a lot of people's main goal tends to be fat loss or weight loss, and they'll always ask, well, what is the best diet for me to go on? And it's kind of a incorrect question to ask, because if you look at pretty much every commercial diet out there, or every diet that has a name, so if you talk about like paleo or vegan or vegetarian or Weight Watchers or any type of diet that's commercially out there, Atkins, South Beach, all these, you can find people that have done them and been successful. You can also find people that have done them and haven't been successful. So it's not a question of which one works, because to some degree they will all work if done. So then you have to ask, well, what is the fundamentals that they're all addressing that is leading to the result? And so then you have to go and look back, well, they're all, number one, going to be addressing the calories issue. They're going to have to be putting someone in calorie deficit. Most of them, or any real sensible approach, is mainly going to be based on real foods, whether that's plant-based for vegetarian, or whether it's paleo, or whether it's Like as even standard government guidelines are still mainly whole real foods as opposed to heavily processed junk foods. So we know the kind of core fundamentals. So once you can keep those in, you just need to find a way that's going to suit your lifestyle, that you're able to fit that in, as opposed to buying into one ideology. And then also for all the other types of diets, there's certain cases where they can work really well. And I've mentioned this on the podcast a number of times. Like you take a ketogenic diet, has some amazing applications, can be really, really useful. But we don't go and have to say that everyone should be on it. Same thing for low carb, high fat diets. Same thing for high carb, low fat diets. There's always a context and application for each one, as opposed to one being always better than the other.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one kind of common theme with all these diets is that what I see happening, and I think why all these diets get like a huge kind of praising in the beginning, and they're like just a quick fire that fades very quickly. Well, not necessarily even very quickly, but what tends to happen is that people get great results initially, and then they kind of start to wear off. And I think that's the reason why these diets are able to die out relatively quickly. And it just always makes me wonder, like, why is it because of the kind of concoctions that people come up with on a low carb diet, on a high carb diet, which make it like not work anymore because they're just overeating on all those cool things that they come up? Or like, why are these diets are just not functional on the long term if taken to the extremes?
Yeah, like we know that the success of any diet is just completely predicated on someone's ability to adhere to that diet and comply with what it does. So the reason why there's such poor statistics when it comes to people's ability not only to lose weight, they can do that, but to keep that weight off and lose the success of that they initially had over time, is that just adherence seems to be the major issue. And I think Kevin Hall actually talked about this on a recent podcast, that he talked about this exponential rate of decay of adherence in people, that over time their adherence will start to go in this like exponential curve to the point where they're no longer eating in a way that got them their initial result, or that they need to maintain those results. And so people end up just defaulting back to what they were doing a lot of the time. There's probably a number of reasons for this. We could talk about it on the diet side, that certain diets are set up that they're very difficult to follow. So for example, you take like a ketogenic diet, it's going to be for a lot of people very difficult to maintain long term, as in years on end. You'll also have things like the psychology of the person as well. Like if they go into it with that it's just a diet with an end date, that's immediately going to short circuit their ability to get any result from it, because they've picked a date that once this is over, I've got a result, and now I can just go back to doing whatever it was they were doing. And so it comes down to a mix between how the diet is set up, but also that person's personality as well.
Yeah, and so since we mentioned low carb not that long ago, it seems to be kind of a reoccurring theme in your podcast, and it's just, I don't know, for me it's just so exciting to see how much controversy is there surrounding that, because that suggests that, like, I don't know, what I see is that people kind of seem to recognize some kind of benefit from going low carb, and it's just kind of hard to look at it objectively, because on one end people are just going to say flat out, like, okay, you don't need carbohydrates to live. And so, as long as you can control for that one variable, which is just a new unnatural kind of way of eating to like have a substance that your body doesn't need on a regular basis in your diet, is just going to kind of screw everything up. It just, as a lay person, it just kind of makes sense. But at the same time, all the, metabolics, like word studies suggest that it doesn't really have an advantage. So I don't know, like, based on all the people that you spoke on this topic with, what is your current interpretation of carbs and low carb diets, and like, yeah?
Yeah, like the carbohydrate issue is probably the thing that I've maybe blogged most about, definitely, and spoken a lot about, because, like you said, there's just such this confusion within the mainstream population now on what is the best way to go. Because not only do we have conflicting opinions, but just really, really strong ones, and extreme viewpoints, which people are pushing quite hard. So the kind of main things I would say is, first, the notion that carbs shouldn't be part of the diet, that we don't need them, or that high glucose levels are toxic, or any of that kind of stuff you kind of see now and again. Like they don't hold much water, because yeah, we know that chronically high levels of glucose in the blood are a problem, but your body should be able to deal with them. And if your blood sugar goes up and you can't bring it back down, then that's some sort of clinical issue. That's a different conversation we're having. But for most people, you eat some carbohydrate, blood sugar goes up, you can get that back down to normal, insulin release, etc., etc. We know that carbohydrates have been in the human diet for extremely long periods of time. And so I think the biggest problem is maybe distinguishing between what, like, just blanket recommendations to drop all carbohydrates for everyone is the solution for body fat loss. Doesn't make any sense, because first, we haven't distinguished between types of carbohydrates. Are you talking about refined carbohydrates in high amounts, or are you talking about any carbohydrates? The other thing would be then missing the kind of core fundamentals that actually affect body composition change. So if we're talking about weight loss specifically, and in a minute we'll talk about health, but weight loss, the kind of cliff notes is, and again, I've written a ton about this, is once you have calories and protein matched between two different diets, and you have a level of dietary fat that isn't going to be too low or deficient to cause any knock-on effects with health or hormones, then the exact amounts of carbohydrates and fats won't matter that much for weight loss. It'll probably give the same result whether you tweak them up or down, as long as calories and protein are matching those diets. Now, there's obviously a ton of caveats to that. If we're talking about an athlete, we're going to be more dialed into how many carbohydrates they're taking in. If someone is pre-diabetic or diabetic, it might make sense to have a lower amount of carbohydrates in the diet as well. But again, we even see contradictory research there, that you can have a diet that isn't necessarily a low-carb diet by a typical definition, but still be effective in addressing insulin sensitivity, diabetes, blood glucose control, etc. So there's a ton of things that make it probably just too much of a blanket statement to say just going low carb will mean someone will be successful at weight loss. But like you mentioned, there's the other side of the thing that, so what we're really just saying there is that metabolically and physiologically, there's no real advantage to a low carb diet over one that has a more moderate or higher amount of carbohydrates, if you're matching calories and protein for pretty much the vast majority of people. But on the other hand, then you have to worry about, well, what's the practical or pragmatic view on this? Because we see time and time again, if you look at every study that looks at low carb diets, put people on low carb diets, at like 6 months into the study, everyone has been successful in losing weight. Markers or biomarkers in the blood are all going in the right direction. A lot of it will show benefits over, say, a low fat diet. There are some issues with some of those studies. For example, not matching protein tends to be one big confounder, not matching caloric intake. But then that throws up the question, well, if someone doesn't consciously think about their protein or calories, and just telling them to go on a low carb diet will make them subconsciously reduce calories and protein without even thinking about it, or increase protein and decrease calories without thinking about it, and therefore lead to weight loss, that could be a useful strategy for people. And that's probably why we see it to work so well. But that's very different from saying that it has some sort of metabolic advantage over something with more carbohydrates, or that if someone's including some carbs in their diet that they can't lose body fat effectively, or they'll be unhealthy. Like having some oats in the morning, or having some like potatoes or some rice with dinner isn't going to be an issue for anyone once you're controlling for their overall calories for whatever goal they have, and they're getting sufficiently high protein, which tends to be the bigger thing I think that people miss. It's really the protein that is the big issue that I find generally in practice with people getting higher protein intakes. But also then when you look at the studies that use high protein as their criteria instead, that seems to be where the real benefit is, as opposed to having to reduce carbohydrates and or fat.
Yeah, and just I kind of wanted to go further on this low carb thing, but you just brought up the calorie issue, which is really one major thing that it's kind of funny that it's still kind of a controversy. I mean, I'm sure you know some of these gurus out there who are pretty prominent. Like some of them have like, maybe you even know who I'm talking about, but like he has one of the most successful podcasts out there. And in some of his podcasts, he just flat out said calories don't matter. Like, those actual words, left his mouth. And that's kind of mind blowing from one perspective, but it's just that I think that's one field that really needs to be kind of investigated in the future. Like, what are the mechanisms that make the calories in versus calories out equation more complicated than just simply, okay, this many food in and this many food out? I don't know. What do you think about that as of now? And how much more complicated is it than just calories in versus calories out? But like, what are the certain, leaps of faith that people shouldn't make with overcomplicating this?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, because like you say, it's strange that the debate or the opposite opinion that calories don't count is still around, because it's just so well shown pretty much every time that if you have a negative calorie balance, that someone is going to decrease body weight. You put it in a positive calorie balance or a surplus, they're going to be increasing body weight. And that you can't have someone in a positive calorie balance and losing body weight. So the calories in, calories out model is 100% correct. But I think where the confusion probably stems from is people saying, oh, it's not as simple as just this linear calories in, calories out. So you just change calories in slightly downwards, and therefore you should have to predict this body weight drop. We know that doesn't happen. And of course that doesn't happen, because what they're missing is that it's more of a dynamic model where if you change calorie intake, you have to have this knock-on effect that changes calorie expenditure. So you can't just change one without changing the other. And as an example, one that I'll give is that if you look at tons of overfeeding studies, pretty much all of them will show this, where the researchers overfeed by a certain amount of calories. So it could be 50% above someone's calorie maintenance that they overfeed them on. And yes, you see this increase in calorie intake, but the amount of body weight they would put on wouldn't be perhaps quite as high as someone who just thinks it's a linear equation might expect, for the reason that once you overfeed the human body on a certain amount of calories, you have all these adaptations that will increase expenditure to try and account for that. So you'll have metabolic rate will slightly go up. You tend to get increased amount of, say, thyroid production. Internal body heat can go up to try and burn off a bit more energy. Your thermic effect of feeding will go up because you're taking in more food, so you have to be using more energy to digest that. Your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is like these subconscious movements that just use up calories throughout the day, tends to jump up when you eat more calories. So there are all these adaptations by the body to try and counteract this increase in calories, so it can maintain this homeostatic level of energy that's in the body and kind of maintain its body weight where it's at. So it's only really when we overfeed consistently by a high enough margin that people can gain body fat, but that's a kind of different issue. So we know there's all these metabolic adaptations going on to try and account for that. Same thing happens when you decrease calories below maintenance. Your body will turn all those things in reverse to try and expend less calories, so it's not going to continually lose body weight over time. And so it's not this simple input and output equation, because one affects the other. So that's where I think if people don't understand that this trade-off, that they affect one another, they're perhaps then getting the wrong idea and saying, oh, it doesn't play out. And I'm sure you've seen tons of stuff like that where calories don't count. As long as your food quality is good, then that's what's going to get someone leaner, and calories don't matter whatsoever. Where really what's happening is you're addressing both. You can't just change one on their own. Like if someone goes from a really crappy diet to eating all just real whole foods, or goes, like we mentioned earlier, like a vegetarian diet, or goes on a paleo diet, they end up eating less calories overall because they're eating better quality food. Their satiety signals are working better. They're getting higher protein, probably getting more fiber. So all these things are at play. So the whole idea of like how it's not working just doesn't play out.
Yeah, and I think I remember I posted this I think it was your interview with Dr. Fung, and we had just this mini exchange in the comment section on. I think that's really the real power of, for example, like Mark Sisson's primal diet, for example. Like, let's say someone eats a typical American, crappy diet, standard American diet, no fiber, low protein, lots of processed sugars and fats, and then jumps onto the paleo diet, and all of a sudden, and as we discussed, like maybe your body has to go through some adjustments with upregulating some enzymes for metabolizing higher fats or higher carbs or higher protein intake. Protein itself is thermogenic. Maybe the bacteria in your gut changes a little bit to accommodate your new diet. And on top of that, the diet is a lot more satiating and not as palatable. So you will naturally eat less. So all of that just creates this like perfect storm for really, really addressing multiple factors, which makes it so much easier to just eat till satiety and, not overeat, and also maybe become more active. And that creates this initial storm that just makes people lose weight like crazy. But then they adapt to that, and then it loses its magic, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think I'm definitely not as harsh, I think, on like something like the paleo diet as a lot of other people are, for the reason that it can actually like teach people some really kind of cool lessons, like how to base their diet mainly on real foods, get them used to not having to have the certain taste of constantly processed refined foods, and also, like you say, getting them on higher protein intakes, higher fiber intakes. And I think that all can work really well. So not that it has to be the way they always do it, but can all have those like important lessons that it teaches people initially. And that's why they can work really well, I think, and for people that it works well with.
Yeah. And with that in mind, let's just briefly address, because I know you've written about this as well, this idea of flexible dieting and if it fits your macros. So as we discussed, well, first of all, I don't know, I always wondered, like, okay, I kind of tend to agree by now, or learn to accept that from a body composition standpoint, it doesn't really matter where you're getting from your calories from. That's more a matter of health. However, like, I don't know, it's just kind of so hard to wrap my mind around, like, is 100 calories of broccoli from a body composition standpoint, is it really the same as 100 calories of table sugar? Or what do you is it really the same?
No, I think the people that are kind of pushing different ideas around, say, if it fits your macros, as one example, you have two different almost camps that would be doing it. You have people that work out their calorie and macronutrient targets and just try and fit as much processed junk in there as possible. Then you have people who are taking what flexible dieting essentially really is, and the same sensible stuff we talked about earlier of plenty of whole foods, lots of protein, fiber, vegetables for most of the diet, but they're able to fit in some other discretionary calories from whatever other source they want that can make up their macronutrients. And so the whole idea of, like, when you start comparing things like broccoli versus sugar, of course they're going to be metabolically different because they have different fiber contents, they have different protein intakes. One is just pure sugar that's going to be rapidly digested, and so they have different macronutrient breakdowns. First of all, there's also then, like you mentioned, health things around like their phytonutrient content, their nutrient density, which won't really impact body composition too much. But the big thing of how much do the sources of foods matter for changing body composition? If that's the question we're addressing, then really it's almost like the way I always put it across is Eric Helms has this laid out perfectly with his nutritional hierarchy, where he has at the base, you're going to look at energy balance and calories. Above that, then you're talking about micronutrients and fiber. Above that, then like micronutrients and actual food choices. Above that, things like nutrient timing and then supplements. So going on that, total caloric intake is always going to be the most important. But then you can also get some changes between results based on how you break down those macronutrients. So sure, you could have two diets of the same number of calories, but if one has extremely low amounts of protein versus one that has a high protein intake, then that's going to give slightly different results for that person. And that's kind of an easy one to see. Also, we know, say protein, different levels of protein will change satiety, et cetera, et cetera. So these kind of arguments that people put forth as to why the calories in, calories out model is wrong, and they'll say, well, look, if calories in, calories out is correct, then you must be saying that 500 calories from steak is the same as 500 calories from jelly beans. It's like, no one's saying that, right? That's just one of these typical straw man arguments. No one is saying that. So to pull it right back to the original discussion of like flexible dieting, it's just and if it fits your macros is really just an acronym that people can use to say, okay, these are my set targets of macronutrients and calories that I have today to try and reach a certain body composition goal. Can I fit this food in today, or this meal in my day today? Yes or no? And it's just based on, well, can you fit it within those targets whilst overall still eating a decent quality diet? If it's yes, you can have that food. If not, then you're probably going to change something. And it's simple as that. It's this just an easy acronym for people, as opposed to this whole kind of crazy diet that it's become, and this big movement that's become. Is probably something it never originally was supposed to be, but here we are. So that's kind of thoughts around that. And then the other thing that we could possibly get into is that flexible dieting can be great for a ton of people, and we can talk about the reasons why. But there's also people that will probably do better on something that's more of a restrictive diet, and that's again just down to maybe personality type.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny to hear when people who really praise flexible diet, or who say that flexible dieting is a way easier or a way more kind of diet psychology friendly way of eating than, let's say, clean eating. Because I agree that, okay, in theory you're less restrictive, but at the same time, if you're really going to adhere to and if it fits your macros type of diet, then you will be a lot more OCD than someone who is just saying like, okay, I'm not going to eat these foods, I'm just going to eat these foods. Like you will have to measure your stuff out. Like the more kind of flexible you are, the more rigid you have to be with measuring and weighing.
Yeah, it's so funny when you see it, because people, for example, like you can see some people, again, this is again a minority of the population that do it, but you see people talking about anyone that eats clean or eats like a bro or only eats like clean foods, they must have some sort of eating disorder or they must be orthorexic. At the same time, these people are completely neurotic about counting every macronutrient down to the gram and weighing everything, just like you mentioned. So they have this whole food neurosis in front of them that they can't see and they're blinded to, whilst leveling that same accusation at other people that are like supposedly orthorexic, which I think is, again, more overblown. And so like what works best is, again, down to that person's personality. So I think there's a book I actually just recently read, Better Than Before. It's by an author, Gretchen Rubin, and she talks about like different personality types and how they can work differently in terms of the best way to form new habits. And one she talked about was this difference between abstainers and moderators. So the moderators are people who do well by moderating small amounts of things throughout the time so they don't overly crave them. So in the context of dieting, it would be the type of person who would like to have, say their favorite food is maybe say some ice cream, some chocolate, regularly have that every day or every second day in moderate amounts that they keep the cravings away and they're perfectly satisfied and everything's great. Whereas you could have someone that she calls an abstainer who having a very small amount of chocolate is almost just like teasing themselves or something that's not enjoyable. They actually find it way easier just to not have it at all, have something different, and then maybe every now and again have a larger serving of it. So there's completely
That
different
would be
ways to
me.
look at it. And so those two different personality types would be one example. Then you also think like there's tons of people that when they're doing a contest prep just feel better by doing it perfectly on clean foods and don't want to do a flexible diet. They just psychologically want to get in that mindset of having some sort of sacrifice. And now it's not to say they have to do it or has any advantage metabolically, but some people just want to do it. So I think, again, the whole idea of saying everyone must have one way of doing it is perhaps something that is not really correct.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And yeah, that would be me. Like, I cannot just have a little bit of ice cream. Like, I can easily finish a 2-liter box of ice cream, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yeah, so with that said, I don't want to take too much of your time, so just a couple of more questions.
Yeah, no, we're good, man. Let's go as long as you want.
Yeah, if you, let's say you had an uncle, reasonably healthy, I don't know, 15% body fat, no major health issues, wants to get a bit of, better shape, leaner, healthier, whatever. What kind of general guidance would you give that guy?
Yeah, so again, as a few caveats just to mention, there's probably a number of ways you can go, and this is where like digging into the client's background and their psychology and the type of diet they like to follow and their personal circumstances all will matter. But if we're talking about just kind of some very general cliff notes of not in a coaching situation, just to give someone that they could write down some of the basics that they should be checking off without having to do anything excessive or without having to really track too much, is number one, generally high protein is the best starting point and increasing protein intake overall. For the main reason that most people who aren't really in the fitness industry, so just a lot of the general population, their diet tends to be like pitifully low in protein. We've had some recent research papers over the last couple of years come out basically saying that government guidelines of like this 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is probably too low. That should be a lot higher. We also know that anyone's doing resistance training needs a lot higher than that amount as well. And then plus it has those knock-on effects of increasing satiety, like we talked about earlier. Probably one of the reasons why low-carb diets are so effective. You generally get this big increase in protein that generally leads to a big increase in satiety. That generally means someone's going to eat less calories. So I would say protein at every main meal, get a high protein source. Generally, we see that it's breakfast that's the biggest issue for a lot of people. Both breakfast and snacks tend to be pretty low in protein, whereas dinner time tends to be easier for people to get like a piece of meat or some chicken, etc. So focusing on starting the day with a really high protein breakfast is probably a good first step because that sets them up for the rest of the day. Their daily intake of protein is going to be higher. They're probably going to have a higher level of satiety over the course of that day, and probably just sets them up for better nutritional habits. With that, then you have the basics around like vegetable intake and stuff like that. Trying to find ways of getting more vegetables in. And so the biggest problem people have is like they just don't like them. So can they do it via a shake or cooking it in a different way? And then really it gets down to like, depending on their goal, whether they want to go up or down in weight, what's their portion size, and then have the discussion of whether they want to track calories or not. Like it's probably going to be a very small percentage of people that are going to do that for a long period of time. Most people are not going to be tracking calories consistently for long periods unless they're, say, competing in a weight class based sport or competing in physique competition or bodybuilding. So trying to dial in on their own satiety levels, trying to register how full they feel, what a normal portion size should look like, and then things like being mindful and taking their time over meals. One huge thing that is if people eat very quickly and you get them to say, okay, let's take this dinner that you're going to have, set a timer of like 10 minutes, and you can't finish before that 10 minutes is up. So they have to take their time. Suddenly you see this huge difference in how full they feel at the end of that meal, and they're not likely to want to have an extra portion. whereas usually they might have a lot more if they eat at a very fast pace. So there are some kind of the very basics that could be useful in a dieting scenario for someone without having to actively track calories or macros or anything.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that approach will, I mean, the guys who are really trying to emphasize that at some point you have to realize that calories are the thing that are driving the equation. You would still be surprised how far that approach can take you if you're just like focusing on these basic things and focusing on regulating your appetite and stuff. You can really get down to the levels that like really you only have to kind of worry about calories if you want abs and you want the cover model physique.
That's the big thing. And so the other thing, like probably the most important thing for like even general health is like sleep. And people like underestimate how much of a knock-on effect that has. So if we're talking about trying to regulate how someone's own appetite and how much satiety they have and generally regulate their own intake so that they're not going to be over-consuming, like people don't realize how much important sleep plays into that as well. So not only does it have health impacts and affects all the hormonal system in the body, pretty much affects everything, but you see from even 2 nights of curtailing sleep. I think there was a recent study, they took people who had like 10 hours of in-bed time for like 4 nights. And then for 2 nights, they just gave them 4 hours of sleep. And you look at their changes in their hormones, like leptin levels like drop massively, like 24 or 25%. Ghrelin levels like just went through the roof. So those 2 hormones in combination mean that someone's going to be really, really hungry, has this massive drive to eat, and then they're going to have this internal drive to move around or expend less energy. So straight away, anyone who is sleep deprived and going around on like 5 hours of sleep a night is already fighting a losing battle against those things that their brain and their hormones are telling them. So even getting like you said, most people can get so far on just those basics of getting good quality food most of the time, high protein, getting enough sleep, and those kind of general things, getting out and being active. And then when they get down to relatively lean levels and they want to get really lean, then they can start dialing it in with like tracking and all that sort of cool stuff.
Yeah, the sleep thing is interesting because I for example definitely notice, and I think most people can attest to this, that if I don't sleep like only like 5 or 6 hours, I will be hungry pretty much instantly, and all day I will be just in this grazing food seeking mode. And with that said, it's interesting because and I know or you told me that you wanted to have John Kiefer on your podcast, which he had a lot of cool takes on how cortisol kind of and you do see that you have like 2 populations of people, and one of them, when they go through a very stressful period, they will tend to lose a ton of weight, and the other type of people will tend to kind of balloon up a lot more than you would expect it. And his argument is that cortisol in an overfeeding kind of state is very, very detrimental, but when you don't eat too much, cortisol can actually be a very good fat mobilizer. So I don't know if that's true, but that's a good kind of band-aid or whatever, like to think about when you go through.
Yeah, I mean, cortisol itself is a catabolic hormone, and so typically people would have just thought of it as breaking down muscle, and so their cortisol is bad, and that's why people try to minimize cortisol after resistance training, for example. But we know that cortisol will, like you say, mobilize fat from fat stores, and so it will like generally be higher when you have those. So when people go through like fasting periods or use caffeine, for example, trying to mobilize fat, cortisol is still at work to mobilize some of the fat there as well. So there's probably a number of things going on when people either lose or gain weight in different stressful periods. And again, it probably impacts on how, not only does it affect things like cortisol, but probably how it affects their whole endocrine system, and then how that has a knock-on effect on, say, eating habits and sleep behavior. And so if it's changing someone's eating behavior to drive them to consume more food and to not really move around and not really sleep properly, then they're likely going to be gaining weight in that phase. Whereas if it does the opposite and it decreases appetite, like we know for some people. Maybe that's what's going on there. But it's certainly an interesting area because it just affects so much when the kind of sleep is out of whack.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, I'm really curious what kind of discoveries we will have on that in the future. So, Danny, a random question: how is your diet looking like these days?
And at the moment, I haven't tracked pretty much anything in a while. It's been quite more like a intuitive based eating. A lot of mornings will generally be the first few hours won't really take in anything. It will be just like a bit of a fast, maybe some coffee, and then the first meal will generally be something either like maybe some eggs and some salmon, or maybe it might just be a get like a NutriBullet and get some protein and some veggies and fruit in there and do that sort of thing. Same thing, lunch is going to be generally some piece of meat and some vegetables, maybe something like some rice or potatoes. Dinner tends to be the same, and then snacks can be something generally like some maybe Greek yogurt and some protein, maybe with some either some nuts or something like that thrown in. It tends to be very static, nothing too kind of crazy. And I'm not too inventive or creative, so it tends to be a lot of the same stuff all the time. And then from days to days, it might change. You might have something different. Big training days, get some gelato and waffles and stuff in, which has kind of been my thing lately. And that's kind of pretty much it. But yeah, not tracking too much at the moment, just because there's no real need, mainly based just trying to get strength up at the moment. So there's been no set tracking. I generally know where calorie intake is coming in just because I've done it for so long, and just keeping protein high, getting enough carbs I can train, and that's it. If I notice I need more, we'll push it up a bit, but haven't dialed in anything specifics at the moment.
Yeah, cool. So almost sounds like you're carb backloading.
Some days, yeah, it does pretty much look close to that. Although now and again, I will have some oats in the morning, depending on training. But yeah, at the moment, it's a pretty similar structure.
Cool. So what kind of guests are you, or if that's not a secret, looking forward to interview, or what kind of topics are you looking forward to explore more on your podcast?
At the probably next kind of few phases, there's a few topics that I'd say have been maybe a bit neglected that I'd like to get on, and that a number of people have been asking about. One would be around specifics on endurance training, because I haven't really addressed that too much. Mainly a lot of the performance has been centered around powerlifting, lifting in the gym, bodybuilding, some stuff done on MMA, etc. So endurance sports, I'd like to get some shows done on, and I've been in talks with a few kind of cool guests that should be on soon. One would be James Morton, who is the nutritionist for Team Sky, and is also does nutrition for Liverpool Football Club in the UK as well. So that'd be one area. I'm interested in, again, a lot of the applications that apply to behavior change and coaching itself, because I think a large percentage of the people that listen are based in the fitness industry or professionals, either healthcare or in fitness themselves. And then just for people that generally themselves, understanding habit formation and change is something I've done a few shows on already. I think like right at the start, episode 7 and episode 14 looked at a lot of habit change stuff. Tried to look at the mindset stuff with Dr. Brian Wansick later on. So to get on more of those kind of practical stuff, I think it is huge, because it's really interesting getting into the nerdy science stuff, and I love that. But at the same time, having the ability to transfer that into like practically how do you go and make that happen is really interesting to me. So trying to get more practitioners on the show, people that are doing coaching in some sense, and trying to get what they're doing and how they're working it would be an interesting one, as opposed to only looking at the kind of research end. So they're the kind of two big areas that probably the next month or so we'll see some people on.
Cool, very cool. All right, well, I'm very excited. Again, I'm really loving your podcast, and I think you're definitely one of the best hosts out there. So yeah, this has been an amazing interview. Thank you so much for coming on, and please just quickly tell people where they can find you and find resources about you and all that stuff.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Abel. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I appreciate you taking the time to take me on the show. So where people can find me is just if they go to sigmanutrition.com, you'll see the website, the blog is there, podcast is there. You'll find the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher or whatever podcasting app you use. Just type in Sigma Nutrition Radio and they'll find it there. And yeah, if they get on over to the site and there's a place there to click and sign up to the email list if they want to do that, where I'll send them out some extra stuff. And then on Facebook, if you just either type in my name, you'll find my personal page, or Sigma Nutrition will bring them to the Sigma Nutrition page. And there's also a Sigma Nutrition group there as well they'll be able to find. And that's pretty much it. Twitter, at Nutrition Danny is my handle. And then they can find me on Instagram and stuff like that as well.
Cool, very cool. All right, well then, everybody, check Danny out and go to sigmanutrition.com. And yeah, thanks everybody for watching. For all the, I'm sure hundreds of thousands of people who are going to watch this. Thank you so much. And yeah, I will see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks, Abel.
All right, thank you.